Leonardo da Vinci's paintings are too realistic to be real. Today the internet is full of articles about Leonardo da Vinci's unique painting technique. It is even claimed that he is the inventor of nanotechnology, but reality is stronger than any fantasy. It seems that he didn't always paint his own paintings. Let's look at this incredible story step by step and strictly based on evidence. V.O. In any case, the reader can choose at any moment to stop delving further into the techniques of Renaissance art. If you feel that something is off here, put it aside, don't read. You can continue to listen with pleasure and trust to the nonsense that art historians say. First, the amazing realism of Renaissance paintings. Europeans are very meticulous people. And so one day, the British artist David Hockney, while examining the drawings of Ingres, decided to look at them under magnification. He was amazed at how realistic these works are. And Hockney also noticed a clear similarity with the works of the contemporary artist Warhol, who projected a photo onto a canvas and traced it. Hockney concluded that Ingres used a camera lucida. The device, which is a simple optical instrument, is a prism attached to a stand on a drawing board. And the artist, looking at his drawing, sees the real image with one eye and his own drawing in hand with the other. This contributes to the realism of the image. It occurred to him to try to study a variety of paintings from different countries and eras. And that's understandable. It turns out that painting a truly realistic picture is not easy at all. Could it be that artists used all sorts of optical tricks in ancient times? Here he was in for many interesting discoveries. It turned out that Renaissance artists, that is, the 14th, 15th centuries, created works with such realism that it would be simply impossible to achieve without the use of optics. Here's a remarkable example. A painting by Jan van Eyck called the Arnolfini Portrait. In the painting, there's an image of a metal chandelier candelabrum. To confirm his hypothesis, Hockney even commissioned an identical metal chandelier. It was made. And then, after choosing the right light source, he got exactly the same highlights as in the painting. But why does it have to be optics? The curious reader might ask. Maybe the artist just carefully and meticulously painted what he saw? But that's the thing, reflections on metal aren't just light and shadow. If you change the observer's eye position by even a fraction of a degree relative to the object, the reflection disappears. So to achieve this kind of result, the artist would have had to fix his head in a clamp and work with the brush at lightning speed. After all, the light source is the sun, and it moves. Without this, you can't remember the highlights and there's no way to reproduce them from your imagination. It will look beautiful, but it won't match reality. Second, artists have been using optics since ancient times. Let me emphasize again that these conclusions were made by a professional artist who is personally familiar with painting. Moreover, Koch did not notice the distortions characteristic of the use of optics in many paintings of that time. For example, the universal left-handedness, as seen in the painting from the Franz Hals Museum. An era where left-handed couples are dancing, a left-handed old man is wagging his finger at them, and a left-handed monkey is peeking under a woman's dress. And we realize that this is going to work. When tracing a reflected image, if the optics are imperfect, you have to move the canvas during the projection of the original picture to focus on different parts of the image. In this case, errors in proportions occur. And here is an example. The enormous shoulder of Antea by Parmigianino, that's around 1537, and the small head of Lady Genoese by Antonis van Dyck from 1626. The enormous legs of the peasant in the painting by Georges de la Tour. And finally, the famous sfumato effect. This is the blurring, that is, the defocusing of certain objects in the picture. For example, the artist managed to project the image onto the canvas quite well using optics. The main subject is already in focus. In this case, you can sacrifice the small objects at the edges. They end up being depicted in a blurred way. Thus, Hockney has irrefutably and professionally proven that some Renaissance artists used optics to achieve the most realistic depiction of reality. Simply put, they weren't drawing but tracing and coloring. Third, Leonardo da Vinci was the creator of an unknown technology. After all, Leonardo is credited with discovering the sfumato technique, so he not only experimented with optics, but it all started with him. However, there is another feature of his paintings that Hockney did not study. For example, on the famous masterpiece Mona Lisa, there is not a single brushstroke or fingerprint. That means he didn't just trace and color, but did it in some unimaginable way. I have to admit, I was truly surprised by the words of a remarkable woman art historian who once spoke on the Cultura channel in the program Academia. She said that today, artists are simply unable to replicate the achievements of the masters of past centuries. They just can't paint like that. The secrets of mastery have been lost. Immediately, a question arose in the audience. What about forgeries? But she said that most often people just forge the signatures of famous artists on paintings by unknown artists from the same period and with a similar level of skill. So, is that why these paintings are considered priceless masterpieces? Because they simply can't be replicated and no one understands how they were made? And in the case of Leonardo da Vinci, the techniques are completely beyond the limits of artistic technology, which is why research on such paintings continues even today. For example, the laboratory of the Center for Study and Restoration of Museums and the European Synchrotron Radiation Laboratory recently joined forces to uncover the secrets of Leonardo's mastery. This was reported in an article published in the scientific journal Angewandte Chemie. The research was led by Dr. Philipp Wagner. The scientists used a method called X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. This allows them to study the structure of the layers without taking samples, meaning the canvas is not damaged. A powerful X-ray beam was directed at the canvas. They determined the structure and composition of the layers and discovered the following. Each layer of glaze is 2 micrometers thick, which is 50 times thinner than a human hair. In some parts of the painting, the total thickness of all the glaze layers is 55 micrometers. This means the master applied layer after layer many times to achieve the desired effect. And they also reported that the pigment particles of the coloring mineral are so small that they can't be measured by conventional methods. It turns out that even if the pigment was applied so thinly and evenly that its particles were arranged in exactly one layer, they shouldn't be larger than 2 microns in size. No more than a micrometer, but possibly much smaller. I'll say right away that these results don't fit at all, not only within the framework of modern research on the technologies of that time, but also within David Hockney's optical theories. This is completely out of bounds. Fourth, how to turn stone into steam is something our Dr. Gaspar knows. An ordinary person doesn't have clear images or concepts of the super large and the super small in their mental toolkit. Whether it's kiloparsecs or micrometers, it's all too little for them. What does it actually mean? Naturally, he doesn't use them every day. That's why it's necessary to describe what a pigment particle with a size of 2 microns is. Do you think you've ever encountered substances this fine in real life? Usually no. The finest thing you might have dealt with is talc. For example, it's used to make baby powder. The particle size of powdered talc ranges from about 2 to 10 microns. I should say that absolutely all paints both now and in the past are made using pigments as their base. Stones aren't always used for this. Sometimes pigments are extracted from plants or even insects. But the coloring particles are always present, and our master simply had no other option with his paints. So, even if Leonardo decided to paint his pictures with talc diluted in a binder, he still wouldn't be able to achieve a paint layer thickness of 2 microns. Since a significant portion of the particles are larger than this size, and after drying it's the pigment particle size that determines the thickness of the layer. So, how can you get such tiny particles? Interestingly, talc powder is mainly used because of the softness of this mineral. It's the easiest to grind. But for painting, other minerals with characteristic colors were always used. However, all of them are much harder than talc. This means it's even harder to grind them to such a fine size. Today this is done with modern mills, achieving pigment particle sizes from 15 to 55 microns. This is a large-scale and fairly inexpensive production of pigments for oil, alkyd and other similar paints. This size is considered optimal. On the other hand, the smaller the particles, the better the properties of the paint. On the other hand, the grinding process also takes a lot of time and is associated with various technological difficulties. So it turns out that the current level of mass technology allows us to apply a single layer of paint about 30 microns thick. And our cars, painted in several layers, generally have a coating thickness from 80 to 100 microns. So how did Leonardo da Vinci make his paints then? That's really unclear. Everything that is ground or produced by other advanced methods, even finer, is already called micropowders. And this is the subject of other fields: micropolishing, optics, science, nanotechnology, and printing. Printing inks are a special area. Pigments for them are produced by a very complex chemical process. With these methods, the particles are grown and crystallized in a specific environment as very fine crystals right from the start. Then the compressed precipitate is still dried and ground. But that's completely different from crushing a whole stone. As a result of such modern and expensive chemical processes, for example, the following pigments are produced. The yellow color is characteristic of needle-like star-shaped deposits of alpha iron hydroxides ranging in size from 0.01 to 10 micrometers. The red color comes from tabular crystals of hematite iron oxide, alpha Fa2O3, ranging in size from 0.05 to 1 micrometer. An increase in size to 10 to 20 micrometers shifts the shade toward cherry and lilac tones. This is exactly the kind of fineness that our artist would need for his sfumato effect. But among these pigments, not all sizes are used for printing inks either. As a result, the ink for letterpress and offset printing forms a printed layer of less than 2 microns on the finished print. So how did Leonardo da Vinci manage to technologically surpass our modern chemical plants with his medieval mortar? But of course, this doesn't stump art historians and scientific skeptics. So what they say? He took his mortar and ground it more thoroughly. That's what geniuses do, let him work harder. So I had to figure out what that really means. To grind thoroughly in a mortar, and what such a tool is actually capable of. It turns out there are techniques and guidelines for the process of grinding in a mortar. Today, this process is still preserved in the pharmacy business. There is a particular feature: the finer the active substance is ground, the stronger its effect on the body. That's why pharmacists try to grind it thoroughly. But everything has its limits. Here, the limit is this: if you can still see individual particles with the naked eye, keep working. But if you end up with a completely uniform powder, then stop using the pestle. You no longer have a criterion you need to reach. You can keep grinding in the mortar for a whole year, but nothing will change visually. Did you grind it well or not? How many microns did you reach? There's no way to tell. The method claims that the human eye can distinguish individual particles of 70 microns in a single colored powder. That's why when pigments are ground down to 15 to 55 microns today, they no longer rely on eyesight, but use control sieving with microsieves. So what am I supposed to think? Leonardo's eyesight resolution was 40 times higher than that of all other people. That's too much even for a genius. And if we assume that Leonardo da Vinci, before making his paints, also wove himself a microsieve, then the Mona Lisa itself is no longer surprising, because everything there and beyond is precise and micro. Too much absurd and impossible stuff piles up on top of each other. Maybe this painting, like many others from that time, was simply made in a different way, especially since it fits well with the phrase "the secret is lost." What else is there to lose? Like some other manufacturing technology, the way the brush was trimmed, or the composition of the wiping cloth. Yeah, I guess it's time to stop fooling us already. Modern people aren't so stupid that after several centuries of painting with the same tools and materials, as art historians claim, they couldn't repeat the achievements of a single person. Fifth, maybe it's a print? Art experts claim that Leonardo da Vinci's painting technique was as follows. First, he would prepare the paints in a mortar using a method that, as we found out, was impossible. Obviously, he used his genetically modified eyes, in which a modernized lens with increased transparency complemented the retina, which had 40 times more light-sensitive cones. It was probably terrifying to look into such eyes, and it's unlikely that such eyes would even fit in a human head. But they are exactly what provide the necessary image resolution for monitoring the production of micropowders in the mortar. Then he would apply paint of a single tone to the necessary spots in different parts of the painting with broad strokes, whose edges and transitions were indistinguishable to the eye, never making a mistake in placement or contrast. Apparently, he would first create layered tracings and complex color schemes, and also used amazing nano brushes that allowed him not only to apply paint precisely where needed along the contours, but also to leave no brush marks while controlling the density of the tone. Such a tool would perfectly combine the properties of a sprayer and an artist's brush, something that no one has invented yet. Then he would take nano paint of a different tone and apply it as the next layer exactly where needed, again across the entire painting and with the required density. And so it went for about 20 semi-transparent layers, each unique in configuration, uneven in density, and only when all the layers were applied did the final appearance emerge. At the same time, as we have already established, Leonardo da Vinci had to place about 20 flawlessly precise tracing patterns for each layer of paint. Moreover, he could only layer all these and check the final result virtually, in his mind. They say there were no computers back then. A mind capable of such abstract operations could probably even handle having those very same modernized eyes implanted. Those art historians sure have vivid imaginations. Against such realities, any fairy tale would seem believable. I can also add that the mentioned technology is strikingly similar to modern multicolor printing. In that process, a color image is also separated into single color layers. Then they are applied to the paper in layers, each less than 2 microns thick. By overlapping, these layers create a multicolored image. But today, the number of these layers ranges from 2 to 6. A larger number is not justified for modern technology. It's complex and bulky, and Leonardo used up to 20 layers. Actually, color printing already existed during the time of Leonardo da Vinci. For example, Scheffer, a student of Gutenberg, was already using colored inks, blue and red, for printing as early as 1457. His Psalter is the earliest known example to us, multicolored with 3 passes of printing. Of course, the inks there were not the same as today, but still there were 3 layers. However, it must be admitted, though reluctantly, that layers of 2 microns and 20-layered, graphically very complex images were an infinitely distant technological prospect for the printing industry of that time. So we part ways with our dream of a 20-color printing house. Of course, against the backdrop of the official version, you can assume anything you want. It can't get any worse. But what do we have? Somehow it was done. The 6th generalization. Let's still think about what we have. First, the absence of brushstrokes on Leonardo's paintings, and in general from that time, tells us that artists carefully smoothed out the paint layer. But later, in the 18th century, they completely forgot how to do this, and today we can't do it either. Second, the effect of sfumato, meaning the lack of sharpness in objects that are out of focus. We are told that this was done with broad brushstrokes and in layers, but by the 18th century people had forgotten how to do it, and we still can't do it today. Third, the dark tones in paintings from that time are said to be the result of using the sfumato effect, and viewing such paintings requires brighter lighting. But what stopped the artists from choosing lighter paint tones if they were painting with brushes? By the 18th century, did artists already manage to get the tones right? Fourth, extreme realism, unattainable by human vision and intellect with traditional painting techniques. We're told that this is genius, read genetic modification of the artists of that time. But it's well known that ordinary people were taught this craft and its techniques. And by the 18th century, again, everything was lost. But people kept painting, there were art schools. It's not like talented people disappeared. And what does all this lead to? Conclusions. Whether I like it or not, I have to admit that the lack of brush strokes and fingerprints plus the layering indicate that the emulsion was applied to the canvas in stages. The fact that optics were used, as proven by David Hockney, suggests the possibility of developing the image directly in the layers of emulsion using the photo exposure method. This confirms the remarkable origin of the colors in the paint layers. On one hand, one layer is a color, and on the other, it's impossible to determine the size of the pigment particles by conventional means. If we assume that each of the emulsion solutions produces its own color, then everything becomes clear. This is also confirmed by the dark tones of the paintings from that time. They either faded, as a property of the photochemistry of the layers, or it's the inevitability of the color tones available at that time, again, due to photochemistry, because regular bright paints did exist. The loss of mastery secrets as well as the disappearance of all the described features of painting by that century indicates the loss of the technique and technology that allowed for the production of the appropriate photochemistry, its application to canvas, and the optical projection of the image. It is quite likely that the photo exposure technology was not lost immediately. Its elements were probably used later as well, partially together with regular painting techniques, for example, optics too. After all, optics continued to be used and the first elements of photochemistry began to be used again at the beginning of the 19th century. Today, the most important key to Leonardo da Vinci's secrets should belong to chemists. After all, it is the composition and the principle of how colors appear in the thinnest layers of emulsion that could finally clarify everything. But here my efforts are in vain. I admit I'm not good at chemistry. It's true, I did take the time to read some of Leonardo's texts about mixing paints, alchemy, and so on. It turns out that his views didn't just precede modern scientific ones, but were actually a bit different. He tended to connect observed phenomena to certain general philosophical laws. On the other hand, he was very practical. That makes it even harder to imagine this person spending months grinding powders in a mortar, fully aware that not only would no one appreciate it, but no one would even notice. One way or another, his notes are actually hard to reconcile with the conclusions that were made above. But there is one big but. We've been handed so many fakes that we can't vouch for the authenticity of these texts. You can't be 100% sure that these paintings were actually painted by Leonardo da Vinci. What I truly believe in is the overwhelming wave of facts that stubbornly leads us time and again to conclusions about the advanced technological past of our earthly civilization. After all, someone created these paintings and in such a way that they simply couldn't have appeared with medieval technology. And this wasn't that long ago, the 15th century. And as for Russian paintings from that time, we don't know of any at all, as if they never existed. Maybe we're not supposed to know what was depicted in them. It's something worth seriously thinking about.